Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to our second event in the SPGH speaker series, In Search of a Modern Greek Identity. And here to help us explore the geopolitical dimensions is Professor Kostas Lavdas. He's a professor of European and Comparative Politics and director of the Graduate Program of International Relations and Strategic Studies at Pantheon University. And here to introduce him and to moderate in depth is our chairman of the board, Dr. Vasilis Koliatsos. Vasili, over to you.
Thanks, Sophia. So, dear friends and members of the Society for the Preservation of Greek Heritage, welcome to today's webinar, which is, as Sophia said, the second in a series that the board decided to organize to commemorate the bicentennial from the beginning of the Great Greek Revolution of 1821. As mentioned during our first event devoted to history, we decided that looking into the problem of modern Greek identity, which is who we are and what we stand for, from different perspectives, is the most fitting way for a heritage organization to celebrate the memory of the Great Revolution and people who led it. Such perspectives may include history, language, art, culture, but also importantly, geography and the associated geopolitical issues. Today's event on the geopolitical dimension of identity, I believe, dovetails nicely with the history event in May, because some of the issues that were brought up during this first panel have played out and still unfold and develop in the geopolitical dimension. And this will become obvious from Professor Lavdas's statements. Now, let me say this, and this is important. Some of our friends in town have expressed surprise that SPGH is taking on geopolitics. So let me introduce this element of surprise of sorts and explain ourselves in our posture. First, this event is not about geopolitics in the strict sense as such. There are other organizations, entities, and individuals in town who can do a better job than us on this subject. But we are absolutely up to the challenge. And this is very consistent with our history when geopolitics serves as a former of identity, for a factor shaping national and cultural identity. There's no question that geography relates to history as well as identity, as well to numerous other things like economy, health, etc. In fact, I remember one of my professors in high school who tried to teach us the Iron Age civilization prior to the Greek ascent, was telling us that if you want to remember the spread of early civilizations, we need to follow the path of rivers. Do we think, for example, that America would have today's attitudes were it not to be bordered on two oceans on east and west? Do we think that Canada, that has the same oceanic signature, be Canada with the identity of Canadians, if it didn't have this sea configuration, but also bordering on a very powerful nation of very similar heritage to the south? So the largely unchosen geographical DNA of one's neighborhood, but also the chosen sort of geography of belonging to communities of friendly or allied nations in the broader vicinity, seem to exert strong influences on who we are. Turkey, to bring it closer to us, might not be Turkey without Greece, and Greece might not be Greece without Turkey. Therefore, the consideration of the geopolitical dimension comes as natural in any discussion, serious discussion of identity. Even if we wish to ignore for a moment the logical argument, a major geopolitical factor in Greece's neighborhood, that is Turkey, waged a campaign of statements and actions in the last couple of years that did not just include territorial or other claims or ambitions or visions, but fundamentally challenged, I would say insulted, core identity issues. For example, Greek moral attitudes such as pride and bravery, Greek ancestry. Ancestors were thrown, for example, into the sea during Smyrna's destruction in 1920, too. And finally, in what Eleni Arvalere called the reconquer of Constantinople, it converted Hagia Sophia, one of the most highly celebrated, probably the most highly celebrated church in Orthodoxy, and a symbol par excellence of Greek Orthodoxy and Greek identity in general, from a museum to a mosque. And we all remember the High Imam in this viral photo used the Ottoman sword to climb up the steps of the minbar. Here you go. Identity and geopolitics are a two-way pair. Just as geopolitical factors help shape identity, because we people are usually very sensitive to issues related to who we are. Friends and foes alike use these profound nuances, if you wish, in dealing with people, with other people. Examples abound, especially in the adversarial use of identity-related signatures, from undermining minorities with negative stereotypes, for example, to attacking nations after having softened them with insulting or demoralizing propaganda. I suppose you could call it hybrid warfare. So weapons help shape culture, but also culture is an extremely powerful weapon. That's how we see it in this organization. I apologize for the long intro, but I wanted to just explain our position on this. So joining us to explore this crucial topic, as Sophia made this early introduction, is Professor Kostas Lavdas, who, as said, teaches European and comparative politics and is the director of the graduate program in international relations and strategic studies at the Pantheon School of Social and Political Sciences in Athens. Professor Lavdas had distinguished careers in both the UK and the United States. In his work in European politics, comparative foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and applied political theory, he has been published extensively in several languages. Importantly for SPGH, he has been very active in the current public debates in Greece focused on Turkey and other related issues. His scholarly research background, combined with his field exposure in the political agora in Greece, makes him an ideal candidate to take on such a specialized and difficult topic in the combination that SPGH likes very much. I asked Professor Lavdas to bring as much as possible this flavor of the Greek field on this matter. As I said, we do care a lot, not about heritage in the abstract, but as heritage is experienced by real people. And this has been one of our emphasis in the last decade, as some of you know. Not just what we think about Hagia Sophia, but how we feel about it, how we experience it, and if you wish, what we do about it, which is not very much. This will be more of an interview than discussion. And the way it will work is that I will go from the more regional geopolitical factors, meaning Turkey, the Balkans, and the European Union, then touch upon some larger scale factors such as unplanned immigration. And then briefly, last but not least, as we say, we will discuss some of these geopolitical issues, especially the factor of Turkey, factors in and affects Greeks outside Greece. So, Professor Lavdas, welcome to the webinar. If you were live,
thank you for the invitation, Dr.
Welcome to the webinar. If you were live, I would have welcomed you to Washington, D.C. And I know you're recovering from another recent exposure to the American public because you were one of the panelists in last week's Harvard Fletcher outstanding video conference on the Greek Revolution, where you spoke on constitutional and power politics in the 1820s. So glad you could join us today.
So glad to be able to hear.
Thank you so much again. So let me start with the first unit on regional geopolitical issues, right? Related to both adversaries and conflicts, but also to friends and communities of choice. So let's start with the difficult neighbors, which Greece has had plenty. And we'll spend about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes on this. The question again is here, how have these conflicts shaped Greek identity? And are they still forming it today? The latter is a crucial question to us. I suppose from the clinical point of view, one of the mechanisms forming identity out of adversity and struggle is that taking risks and sacrifice and reinforces differentiation. And obviously, there's a cognitive dissonance aspect to this. And even if it's not important for us, you see, Turkey has an emphasis on all these stations of the history of Greece, or whatever Greece was at the time, or Greece's ancestry. Manzikert in 1071, the fall of Constantinople, Smyrna, the conquering of Hagia Sophia. All this is related to Greece for 1,000 years. So they define the new vision based on what the struggles were with Greece. And this is obviously a loud negation of belief that Greece is a post-1821 creation. At least it's not how the Turks see it. So please take on this and enlighten us.
Well, that's fascinating first topic to try to tackle in 10 minutes or so. Let me just say to begin with that, as you rightly said, Greek identity is something that can be approached as, for example, signifying the parameters of a cultural nation well before 1821. But it is also something, I would add, that can be approached as a palimpsest with several layers of historically formed elements of identity. And of course, one has to remember, as always, that not all layers survive in the same way, not all layers survive to the same extent, and so on. But the layers are there. And because this is a palimpsest, it would be extremely difficult, at least for me, to say that this is a national identity that has been forming since 1821. We have become all postmodernists, apparently, in recent decades, but that's not something I share. Now, the role of the Ottomans, and then more recently the Turks and the modern Turkish states in the evolution of Greek identity, certainly not in its formation, is crucial in many respects. First of all, as you know, one of the parameters that we can and should take into account when talking about identity is the relation between the we and they, we as such and the other as such. So apart from other elements of identity, it is obvious that regional and international stimuli and challenges help influence some of the features of this we identity versus the others. But in the case of Turkey, this is much more deep. It's much more deep because if we were for a second to try to disentangle, to distinguish between, so to speak, the different elements that constitute modern national identity, then, as I said, there is one regional and international stimuli that define the relations between we and them. Then, of course, there are other materials, language, regional and local tongues, beliefs, religion, and so on. And then, of course, it's also the impact of different systems of authority and political domination. And if you think about it, with the major exception of the first one I mentioned, meaning language, local tongues, beliefs, religion, and so on, with the exception of that, all the rest is directly or indirectly relating to Ottoman and then Turkish presence. The experience of systems of political domination and political rule is obviously dependent on experiences relating to the Ottoman Empire. But the same applies, of course, to regional and international stimuli. So this is something that goes back not decades, but centuries. What is the issue today? To go directly to address your question. Ultimately, when all is said and done, ultimately the issue today has to do with a new wave of Turkish assertiveness. Since the end of the Cold War, let's say since 89, 90, 91, Turkey has begun understanding itself as a regional and gradually also a major power because of three different factors. Very, very quickly. Number one, the end of the Cold War obviously liberated some of Turkish policymakers and decision makers who thought that they should and could now reposition Turkey in international relations since the Cold War blocks were more or less over. Second, there was a brief but very impressive period of high growth in Turkey. And this growth of the economy and the sense of economic development created also the sense that this was, after all, a rising power with not just regional, but possibly also international projection and capabilities. And finally, the gradual utilization, instrumentalization of political Islam, which we see in the past few years under the Erdogan regime becoming more and more relevant. This move with Hagia Sophia is typical of the way in which the Erdogan regime tries to instrumentalize political Islam. And we need to keep in mind the fact that although most of us in the West, certainly in Greece, but also people in Europe, in the United States, Canada, and Australia, in various parts of the world, were either annoyed or in some cases dismayed and shocked by the decision on Hagia Sophia. There were other people, of course, and networks and even states that were eager and keen to pronounce the positive verdict regarding the decision on Hagia Sophia. So this had an important impact on the Turkish image throughout political Islam, and the impact was, of course, a positive one. So basically, the way to answer your point and to introduce this huge topic is by suggesting that, on the one hand, you have a deep historical background of difficult relations between a cultural nation that was there well before 1821, obviously, and we can approach it, as I said, like a palimpsest with several historical layers, and the Ottoman and then Turkish presence. On the other hand, however, we also have a much more recent, present, current issue and challenge, which is the new self-understanding of the Turkish state as a regional power with a very assertive way, and also gradually with a revisionist agenda, the notion that we have to rethink most of the foundations upon which the current peaceful order in Eastern Mediterranean stands, including even, as the Turkish president has clearly explained, the Lausanne Treaty, which affects a number of countries beyond Greece and Turkey, and also is, to my mind, a very clear indication of what I call revisionist and what some of us call a revisionist term in Turkish politics. All this has an impact on several levels when it comes to the evolution of this palimpsest that we can call Greek identity before and after 1821, because it appears that the Turkish factor is again becoming itself more evident. It makes itself being felt in a very clear way. And therefore, it becomes one of the factors. It's not obviously and thankfully the sole factor, but it's one of the external factors that play a crucial role in the evolution of contemporary Greek identity. After all, we need to remember that since 1821 is always in our minds this year and always, of course, we need also to remember that the formative moment in the modern Greek state, not identity, is one that is directly related to the patriotic rebirth of a cultural nation, which was also a pre-statal cultural nation, which is Greece. I hope I've given you some hints within the 10 minutes or so frame for this first question.
Yeah, that's actually extremely informative. But let me actually just challenge that by saying, okay, if this is our analysis, how do Greeks perceive that palimpsest? How Greeks respond, not to the territorial claims, but to cultural pronouncements or insults, like the conversion of Hagia Sophia, despite what Eleni said, the Second Congress. And young Cypriots were not seem to be more sensitive to issues related to COVID-19 vaccinations than Erdogan's visit in the pseudo-state on July 18th and talking about opening Varosha. Do these patterns tell us something about the possibility that we forgot who we are, or at least those things do not really affect who we are and what we are today?
That's a very good point. I think we need to remember I'm bombarded, and that's in principle a good thing, with a number of different stimuli through the media, through the internet, through different networks, sometimes localized or issue-related networks, in which and through which he or she interacts with the world. And all these stimuli are, apart from the fact that there are many, they're also different and often disconnected, and therefore in different phases of different citizens' lives, different sets of stimuli tend to gain in significance. And in this globalized village, in this globalized world we live in, the stimuli are numerous, like I said, usually disconnected, and very, very often compete with each other for the economy of attention of different citizens who go through their lives in different ways, in positive ways, in negative ways, through anxieties, in happy moments, and so on and so forth. Now, the real question for me is, to what extent there is a core or something that resembles a core of certain normative and other elements that can survive this bombardment of numerous life experiences, stimuli, and so on and so forth, and this exposure to numerous different also networks that, like I said, are often not just localized, but also particularly issue-driven and particular issue-related. And this is a very big question because, of course, the more thin this core becomes, the thinner it becomes, the more debatable is whether it will be able to survive the exposure to so many stimuli, so many concerns, so many wishes, and so on and so forth. And this individuation process that we go through. In today's Greece and today's Cyprus as well, this is an open question. Because, of course, you witnessed what happened with the Prespers Treaty. This is not the place to discuss the merits and the problems of the Prespers Treaty agreement. My views have been public, so one can easily see what I wanted at the time to say about it. But the reason why I mention it here and now is because I think that there was a crescendo and then an amazingly impressive diminuendo. There were some demonstrations, some of them not very helpful, because although I was one of those who were very critical of the Prespers Agreement, I must also say that some of the political discourse in the camp against it was not particularly rationalistic. And then there was this diminuendo I talked about, that gradually you go from the peak of mobilization to silence, complete silence. And this is something we need to keep in mind, because, of course, the economy of attention is very important in today's societies and politics, and people then become involved in other problems in their lives, on their lives in the collectivities or localities or issue communities and issue areas they associate themselves with, and therefore some issues somehow, diminish in relative significance for a certain period of time. This is not to say that if Turkey does continue to harass Greece and Greece's interests in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, Greeks will be unresponsive. I think they will be responsive as individuals, as citizens, and also as a community. But the question is, to what extent this core of a common identity has become so thin that all the other challenges and stimuli that are important, because if something is important at the individual level, are respected as being important, period. But still, this brings to the fore issues of identity. As you know so well, in the social and political meanings, identity refers actually to the different dimensions of self-identification, whereas in other fields, as you know so well, other fields use the concept to denote the relation which everything bears to itself, right? This is not the case in social and political analysis. And therefore, the emergence and the sustainability of collective identities, such as national identity, involves the continuation of a sense among people that they belong together. And of course, obviously, that they share common cultural features, they share common interests, a common history, and therefore also a common destiny. The core of all this has become thinner and thinner and thinner. And that's one of the reasons why people need to take very seriously, not defensively, but very seriously, and reflect on the challenge that identity politics pose for us when focused on minorities and small groups. This is not, I want to stress this because we live in a period of acute and relentless political correctness. And I want to stress, but by that, I do not mean that we need to disregard the concerns, the anxieties, and the interests of minorities. Far from that. What I am saying, however, is that, for example, Macron in France is right to insist that identity politics can become very challenging for the way in which we have decided we want to live in the West, meaning under universalistic principles, under a rule of law, under systems that guarantee the individual and his or her decisions. So identity politics cuts both ways. On the one hand, when it comes to collectivities, nations, nation states, it can promote a core, not everything, but just a core of assumptions that help us understand why is it that we want to belong together. On the other hand, if we take identity seriously and try to apply it totally to each and every group within society, then this is a recipe for the decomposition and the deintegration of societies that have become, after two and a half centuries, capable of enjoying a life within a framework of pluralism and the rule of law. So in Greece today, to respond to your interesting, challenging counter-argument, we're witnessing, of course, the thinning of this core. There's no question about it. But the core has not become so thin that we are not able to understand challenges, stimuli, and threats in a creative way. Because, as you know, one can sense a threat and then respond in a way that can be destructive, irrational, because of fear, because of a defensive attitude. That is not happening. And we've also seen that the far right, the neo-Nazi right in Greece, has been weak from the start, and has been weakening ever since. And we're talking about a very small amount of individuals who think that way. Therefore, to conclude this section, let me say that I'm very cautiously optimistic about the thin core that, however, remains there and has to do with this cultural nation, this linguistic nation, this patriotic nation that still recognizes reasons why we want to belong together as Greeks in the footsteps of other Greeks from the past.
Thank you, Costa. Obviously, in the United States, we celebrate identities, but there must be identities in the first place to celebrate. And we're very glad to hear that the extreme right and the nationalistic distortions are diminishing in influence. But you mentioned Macron, and that really leads naturally into the next subunit, which is the communities of friends and communities of choice. So the key question is how European Union has influenced modern Greek identity. Is the Greek Greek or is the Greek European, which is an increasingly fuzzy attribute to what does it mean to be European when you have this sort of, I would say, melange of very heterogeneous things. Mm-hmm. So again, and much of it is really viewed from the point of view of diaspora. But we do recall the early self-denying advantages of joining the then European community. For example, to save the democracy, or I recall Eleni Vlach, who said to be with good company, the good kids your mother wanted you to hang out with, which again is almost like giving up to something that is better than you are. So just touch upon the issue of the friends forming who you are and what has it done and what is it doing? And then I will come back with a sub-question to
Yes, this obviously is an important element in Greek identity, as we can also see from some empirical stuff. And we can also understand this element in a number of different ways. Let me begin by saying that when the revival of Greek thought, as the great British historian Henderson called it back in the 70s, when the revival of Greek thought took place from the beginning of the 17th century, when this movement of thought conducted by Greeks in Greek took place, Greek Enlightenment and its various threads and strands, when this took place, it clearly identified itself within a European frame of reference in the broad sense, already in the early 17th century. And therefore, despite links with Orthodox Russia and other parts of the Orthodox world, it was immediately from the outset that the self-understanding, the self-identification of this revival of Greek thought, to use again Henderson's concept, was more or less identifying itself as being part of the great European Enlightenment and Republican patriotic wave. That's something we need to remember because, of course, the European component of Greece's identity is not new. After all, the reason why you had such support for Greece during the 1820s was precisely because Greece was directly connected for most Europeans, including British, as well as many Americans. Boston, for example, had a very distinguished group of people who were keen to assist the Great Revolution and other cities as well. So all this was identifying the revival of Greek and Greekness as being part of a European framework, which in turn owed much to the past, the Greek past, and to some extent, of course, also the Roman past. Therefore, the background was there. What happens after Karamanlis, in effect, and the Greek government back in the 60s decided that they had to anchor the modernization of the Greek state and the Greek economy, Greek society to the European framework with the association agreement, which was the first of its kind back in 1961. And then gradually, through problems and discontinuities and so on, led to the Zapion signing of the accession treaty in 1979. This brings to a different level this process of Europeanness. And this level is a difficult and complicated one for the simple reason that although by and large Greeks have systematically, with one or two exceptions in particular years, especially after the devastating financial and fiscal crisis of 2010, 2011, 2012. But these were exceptions. By and large, Greeks have, we can see this in empirical surveys, fundamentally supported Greece's membership. They have thought that the EC and the EU is a good thing and all that. But on the other hand, of course, this is no longer a cultural sense of belonging. It has to do with particular policies. It has to do with particular decisions. And crucially, it has to do also with something that began forming, and hopefully this new agreement with France will be able to stop from evolving further, namely the notion that Europe is not helping us enough when it comes to the threat from the East. Most Greeks in the past 7, 8, 9 years started thinking the United States was a more valuable ally. Of course, the United States is a valuable ally. Everybody who has sanity understands that. But still, you had the beginning of this notion that Europe has abandoned us somehow when it comes to the challenges coming from Turkish revisionism. And that's one of the reasons why I think that, one of many reasons why I've always thought, for a number of years, very, very clearly defended the notion that we need some sort of foreign policy that, apart from the obvious collective multilateral commitments, should also try to gradually achieve a number of other bilateral, trilateral, and other agreements among which France would be a fundamental choice. And this, I hope, will bring back the notion that Greece does not only belong to Europe, but it also within Europe that it can find a safe haven to prosper and develop further. So we're at a critical juncture, I think, when it comes to the Europeanness of Greek identity, particularly when it comes to geopolitical challenges and geopolitical stimuli. And I hope that the agreement and what will follow in the years to come will assuage the fears of many that Europe is okay when it comes to trade, economics, and a challenging but very, very proud monetary union. But when it comes to geopolitical challenges, it really adds nothing to us. I hope that we begin to witness the developments that will ultimately lead to this notion totally, disappearing.
Thank you, Costa. So let me actually get back at you and again try to move it back to the issue of who and what we are. When the EU assigns you the role of a tourist nation, and you call this your heavy industry, which is understandable politically. If we were to make political decisions, probably this is what we would be doing. But from us, the heritage organization, caring about identity, living in diaspora, don't you think that if you do tourism, it does this does something to you different than when you do, say, whatever, frontier computer science or frontier biology or archaeology or other things? In other words, the economic assignments, the piece of the pie that you're given, does this form you or change?
Yeah, let's be clear about something. Greece is borders, right? Greece is culture. Of course, Greece is tourism as well, and that's a good thing in principle. But it cannot and should not be just tourism, because, like I said, it is also borders, European borders, Western borders, I would say. It is culture because it is a cultural nation, but it is also a nation that has evolved again from the 19th century, producing significant culture, including high culture, right? I mean, we're talking about Theodorakis, but there was also Skalkotas, there was also Mitropoulos, there were also Samaras, and so many others. And of course, we need to also remember, as you said, that there has been cutting-edge Greek science. Some of you people are represented in one of the most challenging centers for the production and implementation of scientific progress in the world, the United States. And therefore, these different elements, and I would insist on borders because geopolitics can be unforgiving and culture is extremely significant. And I happen to be one of the people who live this notion. But borders can be not just significant, but also a matter of life and death for a nation. And Greece is European borders. Greece is Western borders. Turkey is never going to be an EU member. There's absolutely no question about it. Irrespective of what different governments, different European and occasionally also in America have been trying to persuade us. And therefore, Greece is a number of different things. There is a problem, though, and I'll grant you that. And the problem is that all these different sets of things appear to lack a coherent strategy behind them. It's only recent phenomenon to understand that, for example, Greece's defense capabilities should be approached not through the lens of a country that says, okay, we are not a particularly rich nation, but we need to be very well armed, and we need to spend a considerable amount of money and commitments and investment in our defense because, and that's a crucial twist, because we're afraid of this funny state that keeps harassing us. Now, that's a problematic notion if you view it from a geopolitical and a diplomatic perspective. I've been arguing for many years that Greece needs to be well defending itself as well as its borders, among other things, because it is a valuable NATO member. which cannot be an a la carte decision. If you're an ally, you need to play it like an ally, not just with regard to Turkey, because it's a valuable member of the evolving and, alas, still incapable of playing its role European defense and security construction, and because it wishes to play a role for stability and peace in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, not because it is afraid of Turkey. So it's one thing to try and research and talk about and publicize and try people to make understand what sort of revisionist factor for the Mediterranean and beyond Turkey represents. It's another thing to say that I want Greece to be well armed and able to defend itself because it's afraid of Turkey. No, Greece needs to have defensive and military capabilities because Greece needs to play a role within NATO, a role with the evolving European Union defense and security structure, a role for Mediterranean stability and peace. And these notions are different. The agreement with France is capable to simultaneously deter Turkey to some extent, so play a role in the framework of deterrence vis-à-vis Turkey, and also put forward and promote Greece's role in the context of the evolving, slowly evolving, but believe me, evolving European framework for defense and security. That's one of the reasons why I've been so supportive for a number of years, even when some people thought of it rather dismissively, of a new strategic relationship with France.
So thank you. So essentially what you're telling us, and you've analyzed it quite extensively for the time I gave you, that despite the fact that there is a dilution factor coming from the internet bombardment with these highly undifferentiated and undifferentiating messages and journalism, and despite the fact that there were some economic assignments coming naturally as part of belonging to communities of choice, like tourism and so on, there is still a lot of room to differentiate, feel proud, play a more significant role in the Western architecture, and so on. And you made it very clearly obvious on a range of matters, from culture to defense and being the border nation. An additional reason that this is of some concern is that because of centuries of dependency, some Greeks would always prefer to be British or to appear British or French than Greeks. This is what Latins used to call Greculus or Greculus. We've had this problem, and this has been a very significant problem throughout their history. And this is why I bring it up and why it's very important in any discussion of geopolitics and identity. And I'm sure we share in this concern.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why what I always suggested is that it's a question of equipping Greece with the means and the tools necessary for it to play a role in the stability and peace of a region, rather than simply defending itself against a rogue state going berserk. There's a line there. It's a fine line, but there's still a line. We need a powerful Greece within the transatlantic and European framework, because we need Greece to play a role for the stability and peace and prosperity of the whole region, not because we're trying for some occasional sort of dependence on some power, be it the United States or France or whoever, because we're afraid of Turkey. That would be something that no patriotic Greek would ever, I think, seriously consider to defend in public.
And that's another important point you make, that being strong and being rightly patriotic contributes to these communities of belonging. So you're not a passive belonger, you're a player. That's really
remember. No, if I can interrupt
you made this point very well.
Just for a second, the 1820s, since we talked again about 1821, was a short but very vital, very fascinating Republican decade, because people focused on Republican patriotism, on how to build different regimes, the constitutions of the revolution, stillborn, unfortunately, but they invested on this, and they thought that liberty goes hand in hand with independence. And this is what Republican liberty is. It's not just, the notion that I want to be left alone. the negative notions of freedom, as in one strand of the liberal tradition, is the notion that they can only be free if I am independent. And that's Republican patriotism, and it was from day one very strong in the Greek Revolution.
Okay, that's very useful. I will actually bypass the issue of immigration because we only have 10 minutes left or so. And I would really like it to bring to the diaspora, also because of the flow of conversation. Because you brought up some things, many things actually, that are very important, dear and near the Greeks of diaspora, particularly Greek Americans that I know very well. Enduring geopolitical factors in Greek history are not exclusive to Greeks in Greece, but also to Greeks in diaspora. For two reasons, we need to refer back to Greece, and we care so much for Greece. Obviously, one is that a very large part of Greek history is shared. It's the ancestors of Greeks who went to Germany, US, Australia, and so on, who fought in 1821 revolution, who fought in subsequent wars that took Greece from Peloponnese all the way to Thrace. They fought all these wars. They shed blood. They formed as people through this history of struggles. But also another issue, Professor Beaton in our first event told us that Athens is the capital of the Hellenes around the world. That's another reason why, in fact, I'm not sure that I would use the Jerusalem metaphor for the diaspora of Jewish people. But this is what Roddy was saying, and I believe he also meant it was a loaded statement, including the classical monuments and so on. But there are a number of reasons why diaspora cares very much about what is going on. You still go to parochial schools, in the United States. I know the Greek school that my daughters attended. I know a couple of other schools in Chicago and in Houston. And you see the heroes of the Greek Revolution on the walls. And actually, I'm not sure if schools in Greece have them, but I can tell you that parochial schools in the United States have them. So the diaspora cares a lot. I don't know if you want to comment on this a little bit, and then I have the final couple of questions.
Absolutely. As you said, the Greek diaspora has people whose ancestors literally shed blood for the liberation of parts of what is today's Greek state. And this has been alive through intergenerational socialization, and it's still a powerful element of the identity. The Greek state has been, I would say, moderately unsuccessful, not tremendously successful, not tremendously unsuccessful, but moderately unsuccessful in cultivating this, in bringing forward the elements that tie us Greeks, whether in Greece or in diaspora. And of course, there are different elements in their identities, because Greeks are proud Americans, Australians, and so on. And they live in societies like the American society that give them, reasons to be proud for being there. And that's an amazingly positive and good thing, obviously. But at the same time, the Greek state has not done enough in order to promote the ties that can connect us. Not from time to time, but steadily. And I think technology gives us new possibilities now. So do satellite programs and so on and so forth. And I think that we need to work on it to make sure that the links, the notion that we share, that we belong to some collective identity, become much more alive and strong now. And like I said, we have a technology. Technology can help disintegrate an identity, or it can help build transnational identities. And the diaspora identity can be rebuilt as a strong transnational identity, obviously with parts of it belonging to different loyalties, different states, different political systems. But the notion of belonging, having some common backgrounds, and hopefully sharing some destiny on this earth is something that I think technology can help us rebuild. So the answer is yes. I mean, I think that there's huge potential in this, and the Greek state has not been up to now, I think, able to tap this successfully.
Thank you. Of course, obviously, there's many types of belonging, but here we're talking very importantly. Again, I'm going to just put this on the table again very succinctly. We're not talking about the formation of identity because we're ancestors. The ancestors of the diaspora participated in all these very important historical conflicts, but also friendships and associations. But also, what happens in Greece, what happens in the geographical territory, in the geopolitical vicinity of Greece, is important for the continued integrity of Greek identity, which is very important also psychologically. It's a cohesion factor for people. And from what you just said, doesn't appear to be that the Greek public or the Greek decision makers are so acutely sensitive to this matter. They don't realize that all the decisions that are made, all things that are said, all the debates that are being done in Greece do affect the diaspora. And to the extent that diaspora is important for Greece, they need to keep in mind that they need to give the diaspora engaged. After all, the controversy with Archbishop last week was precisely because the diaspora is so sensitive to this issue. Otherwise, it wouldn't really matter as an issue. It would be a peripheral issue. The diaspora does care a lot, and does care a lot also for its mental well-being, just to throw another clinical factor here. I'm not sure that Greece is aware of that.
Maybe not, because as you know so well, this is a complicated and multi-level issue, of course, because on the one hand, most of us want to be very careful when it comes to the sustainability and the longevity of the existence of the patriarchate in Istanbul.
Yeah, we're not touching
Of course not. But on the other hand, one needs to keep in mind very, very practically and pragmatically that the Greek diaspora in places like the US is not simply a religious diaspora, of course.
No.
It is obviously much more than that. There is also a patriotic sense, which is, of course, now part of a multi-level identity that has also to do with the, like I said before, with being proud about the country of which now people are citizens, and they have many reasons to be very proud of that. But it's not just a religious identity, and we need to keep this in mind, because without trying to somehow, diminish the role of the religious element in this identity, as I said from the outset, it is not just a religious identity. It's linguistic, it's cultural, it's much more than that. And therefore, it would be wrong, I think, to leave the religious element and its earthly manifestations, the leading role in its representation.
Yeah. But the point I was trying to make is that if, for example, Greece is seen as very passive to cultural insults or as highly differential to other authorities elsewhere in Europe and so on, this probably has a degrading effect on the brotherhood of diaspora with the Greek nation. And this is a factor that somehow needs to be articulated better than I can. But to us, as a heritage organization operating in diaspora, such things are very important. And the expectation is that in the Greek debates that you're such a wonderful and influential player, this somehow is taken into account.
This is a valid point, I think. Absolutely. Yes, I agree with you.
So we are coming to the end of this. I can't thank you enough, Costa, for actually, I think we've done 4 panels today, and looking forward to take on some of these sub-issues to greater depth in follow-up events. But for the sake of laying down the basic issues, minus a couple like the uncontrolled immigration and so on, I think we did the job that we set out to do. So I will stop here and pass it on to Sophia, because we may have to deal with some questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will wrap it up.
Yeah, so as I think you guys saw partly through, you can always put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we do have one from Dr. Costis Torregas, who's also a board member of SPGH. And he asks, in the era of the internet that never forgets, how do we need to reimagine the notion of palimpsest and how it applies to the complex Greek identity? Are we led to the challenges of actual revisions of documented history?
Yes, I use the notion of a palimpsest for two reasons. One, I want to remind everybody that Greek identity is not something that becomes more or less evident gradually in the 17th and 18th century. It's something that pre-exists, as I said, it's a cultural nation with different layers. And secondly, because more heuristically, in a more heuristic sense, because, and that goes directly, I think, to the question, because I hope it helps us think that in research terms, we need not to try to be a more empirically informed Paparikopoulos or something like that, but still we need to do something that people have been doing, for example, in Italy, a country that has obviously also a very distinguished lineage and heritage, but which also suffered, if I can use the term, from the largely postmodern notion that Italy was somehow the product of the 19th century, meaning the modern Italian state, which is obvious. I mean, of course, the modern Italian state is a product of the 19th century. The modern Greek state is a product of the 19th century and so on. Everybody knows that. There's no question about it. The question is, how do you approach the question of continuity? And as you're probably aware, there have been various attempts. Paparikopoulos is a famous but somewhat, let's say, archaic figure because the standards of empirical historical research are thankfully different now. Then you had other attempts as well. You have people like Kontogiorgis in today's Greek academia, who have been able to investigate the extent to which the kina, the demi of occupied of Ottoman Greece, were able to sustain a level of independence, to a level of self-governance. There have been people in the interwar years, in the 20s, the 30s, trying to show, not always very successfully, to what extent these kina were able to sustain also some sort of cultural independence. There is obviously the religious aspect having to do with the influence of the church and so on. So a palimpsest is meant to simultaneously argue that this is not a 19th century construct, and I strongly believe that it is not. But it also is something that would hope that could help urge people to be more open-minded in their research agendas. Because, of course, if you go back and do research in the Ottoman years, you discover both areas and localities in which people are uncertain about Greekness, as well as areas, social strata, and pockets, social pockets, in which versions of the Greek heritage are clearly evident and very, very conscious. So the response to this is that one needs to try and balance somehow the influential, even dominant view today that the main aspect of today's Greek identity is the way in which liberation from an empire was achieved in the 19th century. My view is that no, it is not. It's obviously a critical aspect, but it's not the aspect. And there have been localities during the 1820s that tried to rethink self-governance. Then some of their representatives to the three fundamental constitutional conventions that were Republican, clearly Republican, became autonomous. They started arguing for themselves rather than for the regions and the localities they were supposed to represent. And this already introduces us to something that has been a very familiar modern area for research, meaning the bonds of representation and the extent to which representatives become autonomized from those who are supposed to represent. And that's a debate that was to the best of my knowledge, irrelevant for the official echelons of Ottoman power, but was very much evident in Western development since the late Middle Ages, when Neo-Roman notions of representation were present, and people started asking themselves questions that are pretty modern, such as to what extent the representative has autonomy, to what extent the bonds between the representative and those who he at the time or she represents are sacred, and to what extent he can be recalled, and so on and so forth. So it's a palimpsest because it is not a 19th century construct, and also we need to be more open-minded in our research rather than stay within this very influential, dominant, I would say, paradigm that suggests that modern Italy is essentially a political construct of the 19th century. Modern Greece is essentially a political construct of the 19th century, and so on. If by political you mean states, then I submit, obviously, that's an obvious factual statement, but political is much more multi-layered, has to do with cultural understandings, and has to do with a number of different elements apart from the construction of the particular state and its regime.
Sorry, my Zoom seemed to have cut out, but I'm glad that we're back. I know that one of our attendees has raised his hand. His name is Dan Waltz. And so I'm going to allow him to ask his question live, if that's okay. Make it a little more interactive. Dan, we have you.
Yes, in fact, it's not Dan, it's Vlasia, because I'm using Daniel's computer. Hi, everybody, and thank you.
Hello, hi.
How are you? My name is Vlasia Vasikeri. I'm with the EU here in DC. I understand that the chair does not want to extend a lot today into the issue of immigration, but given the fact that the topic is so hot and Greece is so much exposed to the issue, and Greece historically has been a country both of immigrants and migrants, and given the fact that Greece is about to receive more waves of refugees from Afghanistan, and against the effort of the previous government to discuss the issue of giving nationality to some of these immigrants, I wanted to ask you the following. Given Greece's limited economic resources, given the fact that we receive from all the European countries the largest wave of immigrants, also in relationship to the policy of President Erdogan, to the extent that Greece accepts the immigrants, let's say they go through the legal process, they get their asylum, in addition to providing for them the basic, the settler, the food for the table, what should Greece do to create some kind of identity for these people, indicating that now they belong to a new nation, and also against the background that these people, of course, let's say the Syrians, the Afghans, are not the Greeks who arrived in 1922, and Greece relatively open its arms to accommodate these people. Is Greece as a nation obliged, or let's say all the European nations, to take steps beyond the basics to allow these people to integrate into the Greek or the European society, and subsequently, down the next generations, to start having some sense of identity when it comes to the Greek identity or to the European identity? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an important set of issues and set of questions. I'll try to be as concise as possible. To begin with, as I'm sure you know, we all more or less function under the umbrella of the Geneva Convention, which was conceived in the early 50s, obviously with a different world in mind. The refugee and migratory waves at the time were different, were less, of course, impressive in terms of numbers, but they were also different because they belonged to the post-war era and to the movements of people mainly from newly communist states to other states and so on. Then we modernized this instrument in subsequent agreements in the 60s. And actually now the problem with the EU, and then I'll come directly to your question regarding the Greek state, but the problem with the EU now, we need to remember, is twofold. On the one hand, you don't have really abandoned the so-called Dublin system, whereby the border states, or to put it differently, the states to which the immigrants and potential refugees have applied are responsible for dealing with the application. So you have not gone beyond this. Despite the fact that the European Parliament has tried in several ways and through several motions to move beyond this and so on, we have seen some attempts, but essentially, to make a very long story short, we have not yet abandoned the deeply problematic Dublin system. Therefore, states like Greece, like Italy, like Spain, from the other route from Africa to Europe, take the major, let's say, responsibility. And that's a problem. The second problem the EU has is that up to today, October 2021, we do not in the EU have a real common asylum policy. So there is no real EU asylum policy. And therefore, different states can, in different ways, approach this, again, of course, under the umbrella of the overall Geneva regime that we approach as being the UN normative umbrella. Greece has suffered a lot because of its geographical position, but it has also suffered a lot, and also because of the discrepancies and deficiencies of the EU system I talked about briefly just now. But it has also suffered a lot because Greece has been very timid. I don't want to say hypersensitive, because I know this will result in a massive attack on what I said, but rather timid in dealing with the issue in a frank and pragmatic way. Meaning, on the one hand, putting as much pressure on the EU as it can, not in order to offer more subsidies, but in order to reform the EU system, in order for this system to become more fair and distribution of immigrants and potential refugees be more fair within the EU, but also in order to fund, and now subsidies may also be important, a system for refugees, not immigrants, but people who have gone through the process of asylum for political reasons, because of persecution, and I guess we all know roughly the broad lines of the system. For those who ultimately are deemed to be refugees, it has not tried to teach them civics. This is fundamental for me. And let me just say, for the sake of our discussion, that I had while I was in Boston a few years back as a holder of the Karaman list at Fletcher in Massachusetts, I had commissioned a report on civics for refugees, as I called it, because it's one question, the filters and who is really to become to get the asylum status and so on and become a refugee. But for those who ultimately are going to be considered to be refugees, you need to have a system, not just for them to be able to speak Greek, which is fundamental, I know, but also to be able to, perform daily transactions, to purchase stuff, to maybe, rents, to maybe go through the needs of their everyday lives. But we also need to have a rigorous system of civic education to make sure that civics is something that they understand, first of all, for their own sake, because they need to make sure that they can use the procedures and the rights and the framework in order to advance their individual. And I want to stress this because, especially in the case of women and children, that is fundamental. The individual rights, the rights of the Pakistani woman, not the family, because as you can understand, there can be a problem when it comes to the extent to which she can express, articulate perhaps even, but definitely express their interests separately from that of her husband and so on. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, of course, is to avoid radicalization to the extent possible. Avoid people reproducing mindsets and propaganda that they've heard from relatives, from friends, from networks and so on, and try to teach them without indoctrinating, of course, the framework of the Western system of the rule of law, of procedural fairness, of the way in which they ought to behave in this sort of pluralist rule of law governed political system. So civics for refugees would be for me to try to be concise, as I promised in responding to your question, would be a very vital, a valuable addition to our tools, because it would help people avoid reproducing nonsense, what they had from different radical Muslim and other frameworks, and they would expose them to a new world in some cases. Some of these people are very well aware of the countries they now live on, but others are not. And we need to teach them civic education. It's not just a language, it's not just what we usually teach them, it's also civics, and we need this.
Thanks. And so we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. And this is from Haris Lipiridis, who says, thank you for the great discussion. The sense of identity evolves dynamically, reacting to stimuli, and its preservation could be effective only in the context of adaptability to the geopolitical context it operates. This applies to Greece and its diaspora. How could we think about diaspora as geopolitical factor that supports the resilience or strength of Greek identity?
Yeah, it's a good one, obviously. There are different facets to this. One, I'll try to begin with the most, if you like, banal even, and then move on to, I think, more fascinating. This is the question, always the question of lobbying, right? Which we cannot escape, and we should not escape. If all these years we did business in what was then called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, were able also to have some lobbying activity in there, rather than simply making good money. There's nothing wrong with making good money. It's excellent. But all I'm saying is that lobbying activities is vital. And then I'll come to the United States, of course, with a very different system. But even in that case, believe me, the Prespes agreement would have been very different, much better for us, if all these years Greek businesses were in some sort of coordination with the Greek state in order to have some sort of lobbying firms and lobbying activities in Skopje to make sure that people understand the Greek position well. Going now directly to your question with regard to this first part, lobbying and lobbying activities, as you know, there is still some lobbying activity. Some of it is excellent, and I can only express my admiration for people who do this. I don't want to mention names, but some names are very well known to everyone here, and they do this wonderful job. But lobbying is not enough, because we're talking about a cultural nation within a huge amalgam of cultures and nations that has been able to build its own, meaning America. The very famous, rightly famous, American political scientist, the late Simon Martin Lipset, used to say that America is the first new nation, meaning that is a nation that was new, of course, in comparison to the French nation, the Spanish nation, and so on. But it was also the first one that was able to form this new entity in a very successful way through the melting pot ideology that was in operation for so many years. So within this context, you also need, apart from lobbying, a very active cultural dimension in the way in which you present and help evolve the identity of the diaspora. And the Greek state has been largely absent from this. The religious element, this is a sensitive aspect, but I cannot simply ignore it. The religious element is let me put it in this way. The religious element is simultaneously fundamental and problematic. It is fundamental because we all, I think, share in the conviction that we need the ecumenical patriarchate in Istanbul to continue to play a vital role for a number of reasons, not just Greek reasons, for the dialogue among religions, for example, and world peace, right? For a number of reasons. But at the same time, we hope, and we urge the Greek diaspora to have a different, more political, more republican, more patriotic self-identification that goes beyond religion and, as I said 15 minutes ago, its earthly representatives. And that, again, has a lot to do with the way in which, for the past 50, 60 years, the Greek diaspora has wavered between different phases and different modalities of trying to reach some degree of participation and having an input. The official input is obvious. The Greek community, the Greek American community, is one of the very few that can boast, a national Independence Day being official American national celebration. It has a very formal, very proud relationship with the federal American political system. And all this is fascinating for all of us who have studied, worked in the United States, go back and forth. Having said that, there was something in the history of the involvement of the religious elements that simultaneously, again, was very important and also in the long term problematic. And I'm talking about the very charismatic, very important personality of Archbishop Iakovos. Iakovos was a charismatic leader. There's no question about it. I mean, of course, people can have different optics regarding different aspects of his amazing tenure at the throne, but he was a charismatic leader. You cannot build a policy based on the assumption that all will be charismatic leaders. I mean, you need to build institutions, and the institution is inextricably linked with the ecumenical nature of the patriarchate in Istanbul. But the Greek diaspora is Greek at heart. It's not ecumenical. How can it be ecumenical? I mean, it's American, and I hope it's also Greek. So this is a tricky, interesting thing that we need to approach in a cool way, in a way that respects all different views and optics, but in a way that does not, shy away from pointing to problems where they are. And as Dr. Kolyatsev said, I noticed very, very sort of carefully choosing his words half an hour ago, the fact that there was some sort of reaction to the decision that was made in New York, in Manhattan, is among other things indicative of the sensitivity of this. And this, the way I understand it, is a very positive thing, because if there was no sensitivity, then you have also to conclude that the thin core I talked about an hour ago is even thinner, and it's going to diminish or evaporate ultimately, which is not the case. So reactions sometimes can be misunderstood. Reactions sometimes can be very useful because they remind us that something that reacts is alive, and we need to reflect on it, make sure that not just lobbying, but also the cultural, broader scope of diaspora being and its bridge to Athens, which, let me just say parenthetically, is not Jerusalem, because it's not the city on the hill. It's also not Washington. Athens has been tainted with too much politicking over the past 2 centuries to be a city on the hill. But still, be that as it may, I mean, clearly there is something to this argument. But surely there is a political notion that is beyond Athens, and that has to do with the belonging to a common Greek community that needs to slightly, gradually, and carefully disentangle itself from the very valuable and admirable religious aspect of it, which, I mean, it's both valuable and admirable. Let me just say that my grandfather's brother was the General Georgios Lavdas, who was the leader of the 2nd Division during the Greek, Italian, and German War. The other was, of course, the later Metropolitan of Kozani, Dionysios. So I'm not alien to the Orthodox tradition, far from that. But we need now, in the 21st century, try to disentangle the different concerns. And in so doing, respect the ecumenical character of the Patriarchate in Constantinople, which is a very noble and historical institution that we want to preserve and help preserve, but also understand that the diaspora is not a religious diaspora, it's a Greek diaspora, and this has other elements to it.
Okay. This is a wonderful way to wrap it up with this epigrammatic, very brief analysis of a great question. So, Professor Lavas, can't thank you enough for really enlightening us today. As I said, we'll look forward to having you more on our panels. And I wish everyone a great, happy weekend. See you in our next event.
Thank you for this wonderful invitation and these lovely questions. And Dr. Koliatzis for this very energizing introduction and set of queries. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.